Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Well, this book we're going to hear about today isn't brand new, but it came out last year. And when it came out, it was on the bestseller list, and there was a lot of talk about it. I guess a lot of articles, a lot of stuff on TV. And Ari, who's going to be talking about the book, he's been telling me about this book all year, the whole last year, because you got to read this book. So anyway, it's called The End of Illness by David, I guess you say his name, Agus. Ari works in the field, I guess you could say, of gerontology. He works with elderly people. He also, in the past, has done work with on gender diversity.
Yes.
He's probably our only new book reviewer whose papers are in the Harvard Library. I found that out about his work on gender. But he's going to be talking about this book, The End of Illness by David Agus. So here's Ari Kane to tell us about it.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you all for coming, at least. I hope it won't be too boring. We're all recovering from last night's play or drama about the election and all the things that are important with that. So I'm not expecting my high IQ questionnaires that I would normally expect from a book of this nature. The title of the book is The End of Illness. And when I first saw the title, I was a little bit annoyed at the arrogance of a doctor telling us that we no longer have to deal with illness. Until I started reading and what he had in mind. And Dr. Agus, who I do not know, and he doesn't know me, is an interesting character. He's a character for the 21st century, as opposed to the 20th century, where most of us grew up, had our being, and knew how to talk to a doctor about what ailed them and what didn't ail them, and what kind of strategies there were to remediate the situation. It was more of a medical kind of dialogue that you had with your physician, who was your physician for at least 20 years, if you had one for 20 years. My life started with a doctor I had for 15 years. He brought me into the world. He took care of most of my teenage craziness. And then he moved on, and I moved on. And so from that time, let's say until the current, I've had about 8 different primary care physicians, which weren't called primary care physicians. I've had referrals. I've had all the things that one does. And in spite of the fact that I've had all these changes and we've had younger doctors, what I haven't really come to grips with is the methodology and the technology that these males and females who've opted for the medical world, diagnosis, in procedural things in the operating room, and in the tools for understanding our health. So what I'm going to try to do, and this is a tough order for this book, is one, give you an outline of what the author is trying to get across. I'm going to refer to pieces of it, and then if you really get excited by those pieces, you can get the book. We have copies in the library, Joe, and you could get frustrated very easily reading his stuff. But then you read a little bit further, and you realize he's a good guy. He's not really the evil, the evil omen of the next planet or what have you. So, without further ado, let me talk about the basis for this book. Apparently, the author had in mind the challenges he believes are confronting us for the 21st century. Now, we've already gone through a decade plus of this century, and we've already seen a lot of change, both within this country and all over the world. It is not the purpose of this course to talk about all of the pluses and minuses of what's happened in the last 12 years, but you know the major scenes of the 12 years that we've been on this new planet, this century, and understand that time is what we make it. It is not what we call universal time or Einsteinian time. It is the kind of time that we look at the clock and say, well, it's 12 o'clock, it's time for a lecture at the Sanford Library, or time to watch Are You Being Served, or whatever you watch on a boob tube. And that kind of time is what we're talking about. What I think the author is trying to get at is the middle of this century, when we will no longer be on the planet, but maybe some of our children will be on the planet, and they will be the recipients of all the things that happened in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. So the question he asks, and that's the one that powers the book, and he has lots of anecdotes and stories, some of which are really quite interesting. And I'll refer to those during my discourse here. Do we need to age? And by that he means, is the process of aging, that is the real timeline that we use to measure how old we are, that he does not really say, but he believes that with the technology that we have in the 21st century that is growing by leaps and bounds, we will be able to overcome the process of aging, which most biological creatures have yet to unfurl. My response, of course, to that is that's arrogance, and it has nothing to do with really the process of how we live our lives. And yet, aging has become a death knell for many people, especially in the latter 3 decades of, let's say, 100 years. From 70 to about 99, we will all be succumbing to various kinds of ailments, illnesses, and probably catastrophic demise to our physical being. But in the long phase of things, we should be able to extend that to infinity. That is, we could live to 150 years if you want to live to 150 years. We have learned enough in the 70 or so years, most of us here on this planet, to know that there is really no percentage of going on beyond 100 years, if, in fact, you want to get to that, hallmark of living. Why we are obsessed in this culture with how old we will be before our great-grandchildren are in college, I don't know, but we seem to be obsessed with that, and particularly since in American culture, women outlive men at least 3 to 1 in the last decades. And they seem to have more ailments, but they survive them better than men do. And whatever the sociology behind that is beyond the scope of this program. But let's assume that both males and females could live at least a century. And in that century, we should have optimal health. And that means no colds, no chronic diseases, and anything that confronts us, we can easily meet with the tools and the arsenal of the medical profession. That is, if you have a broken bone and we don't know exactly the nature of that broken bone, what does the doctor do? First he does an MRI, and then he looks at the thing and has 4 experts come in and tell you that, well, it looks like the femur bone is disconnected to the humerus, and on and on and on. And the result of that is, well, if we put a new splint in or replace that femur bone with an artificial one, we'll certainly live better than we did with a broken or a repaired one. The kind of technology that we're talking about is replacement therapy, biology in terms of how do we combat bacterial illnesses, viral illnesses, and then the physical deterioration of our bodies. And I think Dr. Agus is the name, that's by the way the author's name, A-G-U-S, tries to address some of this in the more scientific or medical terminology than most other people who write about medical world issues. And his challenge is to find the mechanism that signals the body to physically turn itself off and prevent the aging process. Now that's a tall order, and it's almost a philosophical question because his evidence is circumstantial about the premise. But he's a believer and an idealist, and that's one of the qualities that I like about this author. He writes from what he believes and feels based on some good technological evidence. And this book at least includes a good bibliography of what's available that he has used quite liberally, but he did not quote it directly. And in doing so, I found that one of the limitations of the book, that is when he makes a statement that we can cure breast cancer by just doing gene splicing or some other kind of thing, he doesn't really give you a full reference, say from where he's writing to the source where he got that information. Now he is himself a, what they call an oncologist. You all know what oncology is, okay? Is there anybody who doesn't know what oncology is? Well, this is a sophisticated group. But he's had a lot of experience working in cancer research, and some of the technology that's used to at least remediate some of the problems that result when you are diagnosed with a cancer. And what is cancer but another way of dealing with growth? And since our lives depend on growth, how can we confront the kind of growth that is debilitating to us and that will destroy us ultimately, with the idea that your cells need to constantly reproduce themselves? Your body, cell for cell, is repeated over 7 months. All the cells in your body replace themselves. And that's a process that no one really understands, but they do it from every specific part of the organ. It's when the organ or the particular part of your anatomy starts to deteriorate, and there are terms he uses that refer to that, like inflammation, and I'll say a few words more about that. But inflammation is one of the telltale signs, and we get this inflammation phenomenon early in our lives, according to his work, and it stays with us. It's in the memory of the medical part of our brains. Dr. Agus tackles these questions, challenges long-held wisdoms, and dismantles misperceptions about what health is to remain healthy in a world that is constantly changing. Now that's a very important statement that comes out of his belief system. That is, well, we're saddled with the idea that we're going to deal with change, and change in every form, including our bodies. Some of it is easily manageable. Some of it is very complicated, but not necessarily our problem unless we make it our problem, like you go to a tanning booth and decide to get more UV rays than you should, and all of a sudden your skin becomes a problem. What Dr. Agus is trying to do here is give us some insight into how he thinks we should be able to cope with illness, because illness is the key to preventing ourselves from living agelessly. And he talks about a variety of things. One of the things that he talks about that we, most of us, at least in this group, may not be familiar with, is molecular biology. When you may have taken a biology class in your high school or maybe in a college course, you learned mostly zoology and botany. On a gross level, you were exposed to at least a microscope, knowing what that was, and you could see one cell. You know about one-celled animals and so forth. And that was about the extent of most of our biology, at least when I grew up. I went a little bit advanced at that. I got a degree in biophysics, which tried to bridge the gap between mathematics, science, and the biological living systems. And what I found out, I was learning more and more about less and less. And that was not very satisfying to me. I didn't want to know about which atoms collide with the other atoms to produce a cancer cell or some kind of amoebic motion or whatever. That was not in my future being academically. But that doesn't mean I kept my head in the sand. And when the discovery of the genome, you all know what the genome is? The genome is that key to understanding all of the biology of living things. That is, it is the DNA molecule, which is a double helix, and there's a lot of history about how it was discovered and what we can do with it. But make no mistake, it is a phenomenon, and we have yet to really use it intelligently. at least for biological. We can identify things. I mean, I can tell whether the groups that you have in your genome are similar to the groups that other people have in their genome, which means you could be, at some point in the evolutionary pattern, related, genetically related. Now, what does that mean? That means that there are groups of molecules that are strung together in this very complex pattern, which allows us to identify things that are similar or common in those things. So one of the more recent things I found out is one of my friend's wives has a disease called Huntington's disease, and it is a genetic disease. Now, I never knew that Huntington's disease was a genetic disease. It's kind of a degeneration of part of the cerebellum and parts of the brain process that we rely on almost instinctively to live our lives. That is, we don't worry about walking, but if we start to shake a lot, or we do things like this, we start to get upended. And then if we lose balance, we get upended. I mean, we never did that before. That never happened in our lives. And so the new phenomenon is, of course, what happens as you get older, things that you never experienced before, you start experiencing. And for good or for bad, and how you deal with them is the nature of what is going on with regard to living long and healthy lives. As I start to read more of the book, I find out that one of the things, besides learning the technology has changed and the way of speaking about living healthily has changed, basically it's the same idea. The quest for youth, which means that everything about our bodies should be no more than 20 years old. That's probably the optimal age. Maybe it's even before puberty that is the optimal age. It's after puberty that we all get destroyed, and we can't come back again, as they say. But he's an idealist, this man, and he believes that we can still get the kernels of our first decade on the planet for the last 10 decades of life, so that you will always look like you looked when you were in your ideal prime between 10 and 20 that you do when you're 70 or 80. Now, the reality of that is that we don't do that. We look at ourselves now and look at a picture of ourselves 20 years before, or from the high school yearbook, or one of those other wonderful devices from memory, and we find out, my, things have happened, and they are different. And so those are part of the things that Dr. Agus is always confronted with when he's trying to look for the golden key to understanding agelessness. And he associates agelessness with no more illness. So that's why the title. And it's really hard. When I first read the book, the end of it, I said, what arrogance. We're always living in a disease state. And the more you uncover what we know about our biology, that is, the biology of Homo sapiens, the more you realize that it is a riddle beyond riddles. And the best we can do is be conscious that we have limitations and emphasize our positive parts of life and try to bury the things that really cause us a great deal of grief and unhappiness. In the biologic idealism of Dr. Agus, we find that there are things that he wants us to know about. And one of those is this genome idea. And what can we do once we know what this code is? It's a code that sets up how we reproduce ourselves. Every piece of it, and every cell in our body has this DNA molecule. That's why it's able to reproduce and replace itself. It also can go haywire. And in going haywire, it starts to reproduce itself uncontrollably and with mistakes. These mistakes are called genetic or recessive genes that crop up in our DNA molecule and cause things like cancer or diabetes or any of the other chronic illnesses that we plague ourselves with. And he goes through great pains to talk about these diseases from a biological point of view, how we can discover them, and what we should do about them. But he does not neglect one of the key factors, and that is the environment. So we're not just a product of the biology, but how that biology interacts with the rest of the world we live in. Now, most of us live in an urban environment. It's probably one of the more rarefied part of environments compared to people in other parts of the planet. We have striven to make sure that many parts of the planet replicate the American ideal. Good living, good eating, lots of recreational things, and a lifestyle that you can be proud of as you bring your children into the world and they repeat the pattern of success that you thought you had. What Dr. Agus does here is to introduce a systematic view of how the body ages in terms of the environment we live in. So what about this environment? Now, we've been bombarded by a lot of information concerning the changes in our climate. Major. We have to go 3 more degrees and the ice caps melt. When the ice caps melt, the rivers and the seas, everything rises 10 to 15 feet. And before you know it, Manhattan is a subterranean or submarine lifestyle option. And we saw a little bit of that with this hurricane that just passed over, how a city that lives by underground tunnels most of its life for water, for transportation, for passing electricity, and on, once you allow the domain of water to enter the system beyond your control, you're in a different space. And so we get panicky about it, and we start to do a variety of things that are not helpful. And we also get into what's called denial. And denial is one of those things that human beings have a way of doing whenever they feel they really can't answer the question or cope with it. They just say, I'm not going to worry about it. And we do that. And whether we like it or not, we have to accept the consequences of whatever the environment offers us. Now, if I was in an environment in which I was a coal miner, that environment is more rigorous than the environment of living in a smog environment. Why? Because you're outside in the open, you have the chance of getting some sunshine if you can pass through the smog. You also can wear a gas mask and so forth. But when you're in a tunnel that's hunting for coal, or whatever they're hunting for, gold or platinum or wherever it is, you're in another kind of environment which affects how you live and breathe and have your being. And so the point that the doctor is making is that environment is equally important in our understanding our own biology. So we may know the genome, and we may be able to identify our ancestors, but we still have to live in the 21st century with all of the pluses and minuses that go with it. And so he spends a lot of time talking about what do we know about the planet and ourselves, and what can we do to change it. And he talks about the life force. Now, the Chinese have been talking about the life force called qi for millennia. And of course, we don't know that word qi except if we go to a Tai Chi class. And then we realize that the Chinese have already got one of the keys to understanding how the biology works. It must be in motion. And that means you've got to move. And there's ways to move that enhance your whole body function, and there are ways that it doesn't enhance it. But if you do a little bit every day for 15 minutes, you can live a healthy life. And the Chinese, who have managed to do that comfortably, have learned that lesson. We are beginning to learn that lesson as we go to water aerobics or a fitness program, Zumba, any of those things. I mean, they're the modern day equivalents of keeping moving. The best kind of movement is to be in the outdoors and to be up in the mountains like the Adirondacks where you can, when you can, weather permitting, and even weather not permitting. Because that is the story of how human beings and most of the planet survives. It has to get over a particular kind of environmental time frame. And in this part of the world, it's based on 4 seasons. In other parts of the world, there's only 1 season. You know, it's hot, 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 rain, rain, rain. Or if you're the other part of the planet, cold, 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 very little light for 6 months, almost complete sunlight for 6 months, and then all of the local kinds of weather patterns that are bred from that kind of environment. So he talks about multivitamins. And he says that how many people take multivitamins here? Okay, that's I'd say half of the GRIS group. Well, in this culture, in the 90s, everybody was taking a multivitamin for something or other. And some multivitamins had claims that they could do a lot of things that no other multivitamin can do, but there was no evidence to really prove that if I took 4 grams of vitamin C, I would not get breast cancer. And yet there were claims made that vitamin C is the key for all kinds of ailments. Now, vitamin C is a very important piece of the biochemistry of our bodies, but it's by no means the ultimate cure-all of all the things that it purported to do. And Dr. Agus spends a lot of time talking about this particular vitamin. He also talks about a lot of other vitamins, and I'll say more about those later. He talks also about sitting for most of the day, and that refers to the piece I just mentioned about movement. We need to move. Sitting more than an hour in any one position is a no-no for survival on the planet. And no animals do that. They sleep when they have to sleep, and they sleep in various ways. We have one way of sleeping, sloths have another way of sleeping, big cats have a third way of sleeping. But you need rest, and you need to do that in an environment that may be hostile, like one that always produces rising tides in a 24-hour cycle. So he talks a lot about the movement process, and the movement process really takes place within our bodies. For example, if our bodies and the GI tract, that's the gastrointestinal tract, is not moving, you are in trouble. And even if you don't control it, you can control it, but there are also problems with excessiveness, problems with misuse, and interactions that take place inside your GI tract that we know nothing about, except grossly. You know, I feel icky, ucky, nauseous, I can't go to the bathroom, all kinds of interfering phenomena that reflect what's wrong with that part of the system. And all we can say about it is, I don't feel good, or I do feel good. I ate the right thing for a change, or whatever that may be. So he talks a lot about balancing. And in the second part of the book is divided into 3. Let me go through that part. Sitting, of course, I just mentioned multivitamins, and I'll say something about that. Sneaky sources of inflammation. You've heard the word, I've got an inflammation in my throat, or some inflammation on my body. It appears like psoriasis, or some other kind of thing that we really don't like, acne when you're a kid, and other kinds of things like melanomas when you get older. We tend to look at medications as the key to curing our ills. And he believes that that's a real big no-no. Unless they're used with a great deal of caution, and we know all the things we need to know about that medication, does it have any real effect on us? Except it may prevent or defer some of the symptomology, like pain. And we all take painkillers, pain relievers, and they also have their effect on us as we continue to use them. And he believes that inexpensive medications like aspirin, statins, and annual flu vaccine can substantially change and improve the course of our healthy bodies for the better. And he goes through a great deal of discussion about how that can happen. And it's almost antithetical to doing the multivitamin bit and all the other medicines that we take when we feel that we need to take them. He also talks about the shortcuts to better health. And one of those, and I must say that some of the things that he talks about, I've already tried and done before he talked about them. And I found that they were okay, but I stopped using them. One of them is the juicer. You all know about smoothies and blending carrots with celery, and all of a sudden you get a nice something to drink, and am I getting nutritious or not? And the answer to that, he says, is that how much do you need of that? Why do I need to concentrate all of my energy in a juice that's made up of beta-carotene, lycopene, yeah, I guess it's lycopene, that's the tomato, and some other kind of vegetables, all put in a sort of a grinder, coming out with a juice-type phenomenon, for which I don't need all that stuff. And he says it's because we don't need all that stuff that we load our bodies up. The body does not store what it doesn't use. And so we spend a lot of money and a lot of time doing this juicerator, those who do that. Now, not everybody does that, but those who do think they're really getting a better shake at nutrition. And then he says a lot of things about nutrition. I'll talk about those a little bit later. But shortcuts of blending fruits and vegetables is not one of them. And the other term that he uses, and I've always challenged this as well, is fresh. What constitutes fresh for us? Well, you know, if bread is hard, it's not fresh, right? I mean, bread has got to be soft because we chew it or we toast it and we do other things with it. But if it's too hard, it's old, it's crusty, we don't need it. Wrong. The molecules that make up bread, whether it's in just coming out of the oven stage or been around for 3 months and does not have mold on it yet, but it's working its way toward getting moldy, is every bit as nutritious in a way as the other bread. Now, I lived in Italy for a while, and I was exposed to a way in which the Italians make use of crusty bread. They take something that looks like a roll. It's not really a roll as we know it, but it gets hard. They don't use refrigeration for the wheat products. And so they get hard, and they get so hard you can't really chew them. So what they do, they wet it with water, and that softens up the molecules. But they do something more interesting. They say, well, I don't really want to have wet, soggy bread. But let me duct that up. And all of a sudden, it becomes a breakfast meal. What do? They add some olive oil to that after they've got it soggy. And they put some oregano on top of it. And this is in one part of Italy. They don't do this all over Italy, but in this part of Italy, they did this. And then they add some cheese, a soft, crumbly cheese, and tomato. Tomatoes like everything else in the world. And every morning in the summertime and in the fall, they will have this kind of breakfast thing. And they swear by it. They say, this is what it's called chaled. That's the term the Italians would use for it. It's not common here. But I've tended to take a bagel and try this, and it works. And I use it because I really enjoy the herbs that I can put on it and all of the other things that add to it without losing the basis for the food, that is the grains and the molecules of those grains that are still there, whether it gets stale or fresh. So that's the mentality that he's using here. So what constitutes fresh? In the eyes of the beholder. So, and he says we need to look at how excessive we are with things. I mean, we become chocoholics, and we become pizza freaks, and on and on and on. And the result of all this is that we have destroyed the natural balance of our bodies. And when you destroy the natural balance of your body, you're destroying all the systems that provide the living availability for those you're living. We live on a system in the body called homeostasis. And homeostasis is balancing all of the factors that make your life what it is. And there are hormonal parts, there are hematological parts, and then there are the organic parts. It's the organs in our system. If any one of those is out of sync, then it throws the rest of the system out of sync. Now, we all have an ailment or two, something bothers us somewhere, and that causes a disconnect or an imbalance in our system. And what we should be striving for in our everyday life and all the things we do, both medically as well as sociologically, is balancing the things in our lives. Now, that's not easy to do. I don't do it, and most of us don't do it. We get crossed in terms of timeline. We need to do 3 things at once, and we've made the wrong decision about what priorities we take. If we were living in a world where it was just a matter of eating, sleeping, and fornicating, I guess life would be easy for us. But we're not that way. And we've graduated into a system where we have to continually look at how we balance our nature. As we get older, this becomes more difficult. And we start to really see disruptions in the organ structure, kidneys, the pancreas, your esophagus. Things that we took for granted are now in our consciousness, not just in our unconsciousness. And that those things, if they go into disrepair, may not be reparable. And despite all the things we try to do with modern surgeries and all the other possible options, they are only stopgaps to the natural balance that we could strive for if we took care of what we needed for our biology. So, let me emphasize his beliefs again. There is no right, and he's very clever about doing this. He talks on one hand about how much we need to know about the biology of our bodies, but at the same time he says there is no right answer. So for some people, this is all, hocus pocus. I need to take my 3 pills a day, whatever the pills are. And when I take those 3 pills, I feel good. And nothing can stop me until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when all of a sudden I'm feeling myself very tired. And why am I tired? I took my 3 pills. I've got all the energy in the universe. For how long? And of course, that's his challenge, is that the time that we think about our lives has got to be much more involved with inside our biology than we've given to it. And our culture does not really allow for that. We want the expedient, quick solution. Pop a pill, we got it made. Take a multivitamin, why do we need to buy fresh fruit or fresh vegetables? Vitamin C is in everything that we use. Let's get a vitamin C pill. The problem is that most of the things that we've done for remedies have never been truly, by his standard of science, scientifically verifiable. When you take vitamin C, you may take 100 milligrams a day, or 500 milligrams a day, or you could take a spanule of 1,000 milligrams. And depending on your particular needs and the body's response to those needs, that pill will either get used or totally useless as you ingest it and let it go through its GI system. And he believes that that kind of stuff needs better scrutiny, that we need to go through the idea that if we're going to take vitamins, what vitamins do we really need? And who best can tell us that? Well, now we have people out there who claim that they can. When you go to a nutritionist or somebody who's into what do they call those people who do this? Nutritionist, not nutritionist. There's another term. Huh? Holistic? Not holistic. It's a person who you go to and say, look, doc, and he's not an MD, or she's not an MD, she's a nutritionist, and there's another term for those. Dietitian is one, but there's another person. Naturopath, that's the word, naturopath. You're taking too much vitamin E, so get off it. So anything that contains even kernels of vitamin E. Now what is vitamin E? It's a molecular substance. It's claimed to be a vitamin because it has nitrogen in it, and it has some amino acids which our bodies cannot produce. And by taking this supplement in our system, it provides the needed amino acids to produce proteins. And he's a big thing about understanding the nature of our proteins, because it is the proteins in our bodies that control the destiny of our lives. It's not just the blood work, and it's not just the tissues that are there, but the interaction of the proteins that replicate your body. And this is really a difficult concept to really imbibe. But once you start thinking about it, you realize that everything you eat is reflected. So if you spend your life start to think like a fish, that mentality goes on and on. However, this gives him some insight into knowing that balance is the key, and we need to know when is our body in balance or out of balance. And there are some easy determinants to look at that. Most of us don't bother to do that consistently. We may play with it, like go to the Cicchetti Center and learn how to water aerobics or do some physical exercise. But then when it's over, it's over. I got to go back, feed my kids. I've got to go back, take care of my husband, on and on and on. And so we lose sight of that until we go back to it 24 hours after we've done it. He believes that we need to make this part of our whole lives in order to achieve the end of illness. Okay, are there any questions about what I'm saying right now? Does it sound almost like you all know it, but you need to hear it once or twice?
Give you the side effects when you take too much of some of these
Yes,
vitamins?
he has references to studies, and that's one of the things that I like about his book, but I wouldn't take his word for it. He says he goes to the sources, and the work that he puts out is a result of these readings. And I agree that probably he did read them, and he's made his own interpretation of them all, but he doesn't cite them. Now, in a book that has a lot of science in it, failure to do that is a miscarriage of justice, I think, to the readership. Because some people will go on and look at it, just like the internet. You know, when I don't know something about something, what's my first source? You go to a search engine and you go to Google, right? Google search, and that's the present one. There used to be other ones, but they've all gone by the boards. And you look at Wikipedia, or some other kind of hocus pocus. How many people grew up with the Encyclopedia Britannica here? Hello, I can't even sell mine. Nobody wants these 25 books that have enough knowledge from 1957 all the way back to whenever, and have some very good biographies, autobiographies, phenomenon. It's an incredible thing that was done when books were in a library. We're talking about books, mind you. Anyway. And now you go to Wikipedia and you try to get the same information that the encyclopedia gave for that particular title, and try it. You'll find out that they've eliminated all the things that you really would want to know about that subject or that person, and they've just condensed it, because most of us don't read anymore. We watch. You know, we're looking by everything. And then if we're not being passively educated, we're being bombarded by the media. You know, like this election, I'm telling you that most of us should be absolutely fed up to the gills with the amount of money spent on something that should take 2 weeks to determine this guy is going to make it or not going to make it, and that's it. We spent almost a year listening to the dribble, and then the media pick it up and they regurgitate it for us. Where are we going with that? So that's part of what his philosophy is. We regurgitate a lot of stuff we don't need to regurgitate. And if we really want to find out stuff, we go to the source. Somebody did something and they reported the incident as an observable kind of phenomenon. Now, the way science works, if somebody reported a phenomenon and it was observable to that person, if he repeats that, another group of scientists repeats the same experiment, let's say, and gets the same result or a similar result, then we would say that's valid knowledge. But most of us don't do that. We just say, well, the sources say that vitamin C is A, B, C, D, and W, whatever, and who am I to argue with that? And we really can't argue with it one way or another. If we take the pill, and we take the amount of dosage for that pill, we should be feeling better. And any worse than we did before we took the pill. So we don't ask the next question, why isn't it working the way I want it to work? Has anybody started taking 3 grams of vitamin C? And where's vitamin C? Laboratory is making it. You know, there are a lot of laboratories that make this stuff. It's called ascorbic acid. And there are certain forms of ascorbic acid that appear in vegetables and fruits, particularly in the citrus family. And so if you take a lemon once a morning with some hot tea, you probably get the same amount of vitamin C that you might get from just taking a pill. So that's the kind of dynamic that Dr. Agus is using here. And he's very concerned about how the environment impacts this whole system of living healthy. And we need to be aware of all the things. And when the science world tells us that we have global warming, we ought to look at that. I don't know whether people really take it for granted, but if you look at some of the storms and all the weather reports, the meteorology, et cetera, you realize that the environment does play an important part in our lives. And he uses something very interesting in one of these things. He talks about two French restaurants dealing with the variety of human experience. There's one French restaurant where they only use olive oil, and they always offer a glass of red wine. The other French restaurant uses butter, and they prefer white wine. And he compares not the value of the nutrition, but how the different tastes for a Frenchman who likes, I'm sorry, I'm getting this thing here, white wine with butter as opposed to red wine with olive oil, whatever that is. But the analogy is clear that there are varieties of things, and each of us needs to find out what that is for us and make it work or vary it. I've been experimenting with foods, and one of the processes I use is steaming. I steam almost all the things I get naturally in the environment, and the taste is different. And it is good. And I love to use herbs and spices to enhance the quality of the eating experience for me. It works for me. I feel good. I don't feel constipated. Things go in and out, and I'm getting the nutrition I need. Now, that is part of the balancing phenomenon. I got a lot of imbalances in my life as well. But he uses this two French restaurant thing, which is really terrific. The other thing he talks about that we need to know more about, and we don't know enough about it, is how the body makes these proteins. It's the protein structure that causes all of the pluses and minuses in our lives. And if we could get some real key directions on that, that would prolong our lives so that maybe we could overcome most of the illnesses. And it is the enzymes, which are proteins, as well as the molecules that make up our skin, our bones, our blood system, and all that other stuff that keep us going. That's the part one of the book, and it's really worth a book in itself. But he does a nice job of at least telling you what's out there. I don't like his arrogance. I mean, he thinks that the way to do everything is scientific experiment. And if you're not a scientist, it really is a drudgery to have to go through those things. But he thinks that that's worth it. I find that there's a limit to how much technology is going to help us with. But if we keep striving, we'll get better at it, and maybe we will find keys that are useful. The second part of the book is Elements of the Healthy Lifestyle. And I'm just going to read the titles of the things, because each of them is worth a lecture in itself. But let me just read those to you. Exercise caution with regard to studies, claims, and scare taxes. This is, for example, everybody keeps talking about all these statins. You know what a statin is, right? It's kind of a biological substance that interferes with one of the problems in our blood system. And it also causes problems for the heart and the arteries and all the other things that we are working with. So be aware that the statins are useful, but not the end-all be-all for people who have got diabetes or high blood pressure or whatever the other things they talk about. Synthetic shortcuts, it means you produce artificial vitamin C, that is ascorbic acid. In order for any kind of vitamin C, whether it's artificial or natural, to work, it has to be in a form that the body can use it. And that's the whole business of this proteomics. That is, if your body can't really pick up how ascorbic acid in your body can be used effectively, it'll be useless. So if you take 3 grams of it, it's still useless. And it causes all kinds of side problems that you don't want anyway. So you need to know what it is for you. Now, who does this? Well, nobody really does it. You have to do it yourself. You can't go to a laboratory and say, I want to know what's the base level of my vitamin C or vitamin A or whatever other things that are out there. We should have that information. And now, the technology, according to this guy, the technology allows us to do that. We've got to be sure, though, it's a technology I can live with. So if I know that I take 400 units of vitamin A, and that helps my skin, and that helps a few other things like my eyes, because it's got beta-carotene in it, That's to the good. But if I'm taking, 40 carrots a week in coleslaw or whatever else I'm taking it in, and it's not helping at all, it just goes out, in and out the system. It creates constipation and on and on. So he talks about these shortcuts which we need to get rid of. We need to really talk about what are the basic things I need for my life. And he talks about supplements and vitamins and fresh. And I mentioned the idea of fresh because by the time something gets picked in California and gets to the East Coast, a week has gone by and it's on the shelf. And it's supposed to last 2 or 3 weeks. Well, they put sulfites on most of these vegetables right now. And sulfites are okay. I mean, they don't kill you, but they don't help you either because the body is out of balance when they have these additives and preservatives. That's the thing. And one of the things I'm going to hand out in 2 minutes will be about crackers. And I'm not talking about cookies now. I'm talking about crackers. And we're all snack junkies with crackers. And I've done something here, and I'll tell you about it in a minute. Inflammation. Very important to understand that inflammation is a real bellwether that something's wrong with our system. How do I know that something is inflamed? They keep talking about my inflamed liver. Did you ever hear about the inflamed liver? The only way you know about it, it starts to give you pain. You can't digest everything. But outside of that, you don't know you have an inflamed liver until it becomes inoperable. Then you can't use it. And so we need to have a better idea of that. And he talks about this. The need for exercise, movement. We need to do that. Not just getting up and doing this kind of stuff, but just walking around. Sitting for more than an hour anywhere is a no-no to this guy. And timing is everything. He said, if you're doing it at the wrong time, get with the program. You got to pick your times right and do it right. Then the third part of the book has to deal with high-tech health. And this is where they talk about, arthroscopic surgeries, replacement parts, and on and on. He's good about that. It's not a panacea, but none of the parts that we've created last long. 5 years for the best, and gradually lower as we replace body parts. How many people have had limbs replaced in this group? Don't all raise your hands. But when you find people who do this, you realize that after 3 years, that part has got to be replaced. Hello, I spent all this time and energy getting used to the new part, and then it's got to go out the window. And that's kind of sad. And we don't realize it until after we've done it, and then we don't realize that at 90 years old, I'm not going to get another operation for my hip, am I? Or am I not? And of course, how long do you want to live? And the quality of life. That's what I think he really wants to talk about. But he doesn't do that in this book. And that's one of the drawbacks of the book. He talks about what he really wants is that we can prolong life for as long as we really want, not the end of illness. This is sort of like a come-on title, which caused a lot of people to read it. But he did the right things. He is zealous in his beliefs and his truths. He uses the word can a lot. Now, I have found that when you talk about things that affect other people, you should say could. You should be conditional about it. When you say, you can do it, of course, that's saying you better get up there and do it. If you don't do it, I'll be angry with you, or whatever it is. But he uses those kind of words. And I find that a sense of the arrogant, which doctors, by the way, do have, even these young hot bloods. And then this guy's a hot blood. He's about 50, I bet. And he writes dynamically in his life, so that's good. On the other hand, I'm not impressed with how he goes about relating incidents. He talks about the football players who've gotten what is called, what is it called? I'm forgetting all the concussion is the word, and there is what is called a continual concussion. Even if you get one, it still stays with you. And as you get older, and it's with the football population, that it comes out, and it's absolutely horrendous. We are killing the best youth of our lives, making them fat because the heavier they are, the more they can be like blocks of wood or whatever. And then they eat the worst diets just to improve that fat and muscle mass. Their hearts cannot take it. And none of these athletes live beyond 55. There was a good study, and he cites that study as an example of people who do the kind of activity that is going to limit their business of being on the planet more than 50 years. Hello? And we start our kids doing that at 10 and 12. You know, every kid has got to try a football experience. And if they get a concussion and the coach says, you go in there and show them, after they haven't gotten over it, it's the end of that. And we've seen kids get TBI from that. And I'm just alerting you that we can do stuff if we are aware. And we need to make sure about that. And I like him doing that. Let's see. One of the things that I'm always concerned with, and this comes from my philosophy, he believes that high-tech and computer-aided knowledge are the ultimate keys to super health and nirvana. I tend not to believe that. And I think as you get older, you realize that we learn more and more about less and less. And when you're 30 and 40, the sky's the limit. But when you're 70 or 60 or whatever, so what? Am I still going to be able to walk on a trail in the woods, like Muir Woods in California, and just appreciate how nature has taken care that we still have something to look forward to, even if it is 3,000 or 4,000 years old, whatever. He has a fervent desire to blend the high-tech discoveries and apply them to a delicate, interactive view of the continuing natural change and explanation that nature provides. In other words, what he's saying is that nature is here. We've done the best we can with what we've got, but we can improve that. And that's where the technology and computer-aided education does stuff. My final words on this thing, and I can go on and on, but I think you've had enough of me. An unexamined life has little meaning. One of my favorite adages comes out of Socrates. And this man, at least, is making an effort to examine the life, his life, and probably the life of a lot of people that he saved. So that's a plus for a book like this. And it's worth spending an hour or two reading parts of it. Get what you can from it. There's a lot of good material in here, but you gotta dig in and look at it. Please, by all means, get a chance to look at this book. That's why I spend the time showing you. Thanks a lot.